Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and if you did not listen to yesterday's and probably the day before that's episode as well, you should go back and catch those first because they're very important to setting this up, and I just want to get right into it. We're looking at a tension that exists in Matthew 23:35, where Jesus says, "And so upon you, you being the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders, will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this generation." As we discussed, it's pretty easy to tell what Jesus means by the remark, but who is this Zechariah? Because Zechariah, son of Berechiah, is a prophet who wrote in the 500s BC and gave a bunch of messianic prophecies, but the Zechariah whose story is being described would seem to be Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, from at least a century before this other Zechariah. Possible solution to this tension number one, and this is not what I believe, but if we're to be fair-minded, we have to acknowledge this possibility. Possibility number one is that somebody just made a mistake and it made its way into the Bible. Maybe Luke made a mistake, maybe Matthew made a mistake, maybe Peter recalled the details of what Jesus said mistakenly, maybe other people mistakenly remembered what Jesus said and they reported it to Matthew or to Luke when they were trying to get all the details together to write down this story. Maybe the details are wrong at the beginning of the book of Zechariah, or maybe the details are wrong in 2 Chronicles 24. And somehow that mistake got handed down from place to place along the way, and it made its way to Jesus, and he just said what everybody understood the details of the story to be at that time so that they would get the point. As much as this is a heresy and blasphemy, I think, if you're a Christian, we still have to acknowledge, if we're taking a fair look at this text, that maybe Jesus just didn't have his facts straight on this point, and he made a mistake here as well. Again, those are not my convictions, but if we're going to do the eyes wide open faith thing, we have to acknowledge that as a possible explanation for the tension in the text. Possible explanation number two. Everything was square and right and made sense in the original Greek version of the book of Matthew that circulated in the first place, but some copyist later on, having some confusion about how the Old Testament fits together, tried to help the text and made this little addition to remove what they believed was an ambiguity, and somehow that version got copied a few times and it caught on. Now, we don't have any textual manuscript evidence to support that possible explanation that I just threw out. The manuscript evidence, as best as I know, and as far as I've been able to tell, are in agreement in terms of what Matthew says here and how Luke renders it over in whatever we decided last time, Luke 12, or dang it, now I don't remember, Luke 11 that we looked at last time around. So possibility number one, somebody got it wrong in the first place. Possibility number two, somebody after the fact toyed with the text a little bit with the best of intentions to try to help it out, but it messed the thing up. But there are problems with both of those somebody screwed up explanations. The problem with somebody in the first place screwed up is that people continued to go along with Jesus, and we don't get any record of them being like, whoa, 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 whoa. You got the wrong Zechariah, bro. What are you doing? No. You're thinking of the Zechariah from here, and you're referencing the Zechariah from over here. I mean, this would be a glorious opportunity to well accurately Jesus with their superior biblical knowledge and to shame him in front of everybody. I mean, he's in the middle of his closing remarks here, his closing argument. If he got this wrong, thump him with it. And let's just say for the sake of argument that he did get it wrong, and they did thump him with that and point out how dumb and wrong he was about everything, and everybody laughed at him and it was a great big black eye, well, then a whole lot about this Jesus stuff is actually a sham, and Matthew was standing right there for it, and Matthew still wanted to prop this thing up with a book that made him look better than he actually was. Why would Matthew still include that flub if indeed it was a flub that happened in front of everybody and got called out? If it's still in the text and Matthew saw fit to record it, it means that no one called Jesus out for getting it wrong. Way more on that in a minute, but quick side note, the weakness of argument number two is, again, there just isn't manuscript support for the theory that somebody came along later on and messed with it. And if somebody did want to come along later on and mess with it, why wouldn't they read it more carefully to try to make sure that they reconciled the account to what would make Jesus look more gooder? So acknowledging those two possibilities, somebody screwed up in the first place, somebody screwed up much later, and acknowledging my pushback and problems with those two solutions, let's move on to another category of problem solving here and assume that Jesus meant to say exactly that. Why would he mean to say it when a cursory look through the Old Testament indicates that that isn't accurate as we think of accurate? Well, here's one possibility. Some super smart biblical scholars whose names you've probably heard of have argued for a long time in all kinds of well-resourced books that the Zechariah thing wasn't just a point of confusion. It was that. We've got plenty of extra biblical examples of even experts in the law and religion confusing and flipping around different Zechariahs in different places because so many of them lived concurrent with each other. And apparently some even had family tree overlap or names of predecessors in their family from whom they were descended that were the same as others. So apparently just saying Zechariah, son of so-and-so in Jewish tradition wasn't always enough to keep this ambiguity and confusion from happening. And so if Jesus is trying to make a point to his audience without getting caught up in all of the particulars, and that audience at this moment in history is in agreement that this particular Zechariah corresponds with another Zechariah, and they've got their genealogical charts and facts and figures that make sense in their brain, should Jesus take this moment to clarify exactly which one, or should he just roll with their assumptions about which one we're talking about because the point is illustrated with clarity without diving deep into a lengthy disambiguation for the benefit of people who are a little confused on their history? What I just said would be wildly speculative if we didn't have extra biblical documentation of supremely informed religious leaders from this time and other times interpreting who the Zechariahs were differently over the centuries and positioning them differently over the centuries. I suppose another possibility is that the Zechariah who wrote the prophetic book in the 500s just happened to get killed in the same way as the Zechariah son of Jehoiada. One of the things you have to take into account when you have similar stories or hypothetically similar stories is that one group in the future was aware of a story in the past and they wanted to make the stories rhyme. That is the motif. That is a part of the storytelling ancient Near Eastern mindset. And so maybe some people who wanted to punish the Zechariah who wrote the prophetic book, Zechariah son of Berechiah, maybe the people who wanted to punish him were like, this will rhyme with something that happened in the past and really drive home our point. And maybe they killed that Zechariah in the same way, and the original audience was fully aware that they killed Zechariah son of Berechiah in the same way as Zechariah son of Jehoiada from back in 2 Chronicles 24. The problem with that solution to the tension here is that there's no actual evidence of it. It's just theorizing. But if Jesus has been accurate and reliable and smart on so many other things, you can give him the benefit of the doubt that he was being reliable and accurate and smart in this situation as well. So maybe something like that makes sense. But I think we got to acknowledge it's a bit of a stretch. Another possibility here is that Jesus is employing an oratory device that isn't immediately evident to us now, but may have been more evident to the original audience, and maybe what he's doing in this is intentionally referencing two prophets at the exact same time who had the same name, and is enfolding their stories together to illustrate the more comprehensive point, the story of Zechariah son of Jehoiada from 2 Chronicles 24 to illustrate the murderous impulse of the Pharisees and the religious leaders, and the Zechariah son of Berechiah, who was the prophet who wrote in the 6th century, to remind everyone that the message of these prophets that got them killed by the religious leaders of the past was the messianic nature of things. They were pointing to exactly who Christ is and God's redemptive work through him. If there were no such oratory device being employed here, that message, as we've discussed, still very much comes through. There are other solutions to this tension that really competent people have put forward. Most of them center around other obscure Zechariahs from the Old Testament. And I'm not going to try to untangle all of those right now because for me, I'm really satisfied with interpreting the less clear in light of the more clear. If you have a reliable document with a reliable character in it who comes off as making sense everywhere else, then you can sort of give the benefit of the doubt in this one position if the meaning is clear. If the meaning is completely occluded by this reference to Zechariah, maybe being a reference to even the wrong Zechariah, well, then you got a problem. But in this case, it looks like the original audience, both pro and against, understood exactly what he meant. It looks like even though there was a lot of ambiguity about who the Old Testament Zechariahs were at this point in history, Jesus packaged this in such a way that there wouldn't be ambiguity about his meaning. So he said it in a way that would make sense to the original audience. And it is illustrative of the 2 points he's making here, which is you religious leaders are violent and have a long history of violence. And 2, you're violent toward people who talk about God's redemptive plan, specifically pointing toward the Messiah, which is who I am. Smart, good, decent, honorable people who think with intellectual integrity are going to come to different conclusions on passages like this. And I think we just got to remind ourselves to be cool with each other and understand that people are running the same data we are and they're trying to figure it out too. And also, one thing we can do to make sure that we don't get hung up on the small things is to interpret those trickier little turns of phrases in light of the grand story arc and the grand context, which I think gives us enough clarity on this particular point to move forward. Next time around, we got another little riddle to tackle, and that is, what does Jesus mean by, quote, generation in verse 36? That's going to have a huge bearing on what we encounter in Matthew chapter 24. I cannot thank you enough for your charity and your willingness to dive deep into things like this. I know it makes for kind of weird podcasting, but I think it's important, and I hope it's honest, and I hope we're doing the eyes wide open thing, which I believe is the right way to do this kind of an exercise together. I appreciate you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.